Nearly a century later after his violent death, in September 1921, Baron von Ungern-Sternberg continues to captivate us. Thousands of Bolsheviks and Bolshevik sympathizers killed or tortured by him, many reportedly by his own hand. Scores of men under his own command tortured to death or executed with bizarrely cruel methods. Hundreds of Jewish people massacred in pogroms, all committed in the name of restoring the Russian monarchy. They cannot understand as yet that we are not fighting a political party, but a sect of murderers of all contemporary spiritual culture. Baron von Ungern-Sternberg. But how much of what we know really happened? What is fact and what is the stuff of legend? Perhaps this question can be summarized by none other than the man himself. My name is surrounded with such hate and fear that no one can judge what is the truth and what is false, what is history and what is myth. Baron von Ungern-Sternberg. Baron Nikolai Roman Max von Ungern-Sternberg was born on January 10, 1886, in Graz, Austria, to Theodor IV Leonhard Rudolf von Ungern-Sternberg and Sophie Charlotte von Wimpfen. Theodor von Ungern-Sternberg was a geologist who earned his doctorate at the University of Leipzig in 1881. The Ungern-Sternbergs enjoyed a life of privilege in their elegant mansion. Lechgasse, the street they lived on, had a row of mansions occupied mostly by people of nobility. Several servants lived on site performing various duties such as nanny, cook, and maid work. In early 1889, when Ungern was just 3 years old, his family moved to Russia. After living in Russia for a year, his father, a professional geologist, received a scientific assignment in Tiflis, Georgia. And so, the family moved to Georgia. Like many well-connected nobles of the time, by the age of 4, Ungern had already been to 3 different countries. 2 years later, Theodore and Sophie ended their marriage due to incompatibility, and in the words of Theodore, wounds that cannot heal. Other nobles whom knew the family blamed Theodore's frequent absences for his research as a major factor in the deterioration of their marriage, as well as the death of one of their children. After divorce was authorized by the church, Sophie Charlotte was awarded custody of the young Ungern and the rest of her children. Theodore returned to the Caucasus region to continue his scientific work, but soon became mired in massive debt, and by 1899 was judged insane and sent to an asylum on the Estland coast. Moving to the Russian Empire region of Estland, now present-day Estonia, Sophie rented a manor and settled there with her mother and 2 boys. Shortly after this relocation, Sophie met a man named Baron Oscar von Huyningen-Huene, and the two quickly became smitten with each other. In 1894, Sophie Charlotte and Baron Oscar von Huyningen-Huene got married. After this marriage, the family moved to Huyningen-Huene's estate at the Estonian city of Järvakant. The estate was located 40 miles south of Reval, in a densely wooded area. Huyningen-Huene's house was a 2-story tall, ornate neoclassical palace built from stone and bordered by vast gardens. Beyond these gardens lay acres of woods and pasture land. In the Baltic region of the Russian Empire, nobles of German extraction were descended from crusaders, whom had conquered and subjugated the Baltic peoples during the Middle Ages. In the 1890s, these descendants of the crusaders were still in positions of power. Many owned large mansions with vast estates, which employed many non-German Estonians. At this time, many Estonians lived lives of de facto serfdom, despite such servitude being made illegal in the 1820s. As with most other children of his social standing, Ungern was homeschooled until the age of 14. In the spring of 1900, Ungern was sent away to the estate of Nicholas I Gymnasium, a Russian-language high school. It was a boarding school with a curriculum that had a heavy emphasis on liberal arts. Patriotism for the Russian Empire was strongly fostered as well. Estland was mostly composed of non-Russian speakers, but the Russian Empire at this point did everything it could to Russify Estlanders of all ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. Once left largely to their own devices, the Russian Empire now expected their Estland subjects to unconsciously act like a Russian and speak like one, as opposed to just perfunctorily adhering to this rule. In 1901, Ungern missed 5 months of school due to complications resulting from a case of pneumonia. Concerned, Ungern's family sent him down south to the Black Sea coastal area to convalesce in the warmer climate. Ranking in the bottom 5% throughout his high school career at the gymnasium, Ungern was a very poorly performing student. Towards the end of 1902, Ungern was the last in his class. Not only were Ungern's grades atrocious, but he had numerous behavioral issues as well. On numerous occasions, Ungern was reprimanded for insolence and mischief, both in the class and on campus. Despite these issues with grades and behavior, Ungern was undoubtedly a very bright young man, as he had a very keen interest in philosophy. He would even go so far as to carry ripped-out pages of books on philosophy in his pockets, so that he could read them easier when on the go. In April 1902, just before Easter break, wanting to avoid the disgrace of having her son graduate last in his class or get expelled, Ungern's mother transferred her son to military school in St. Petersburg. This military school was called the College of Naval Cadets. Starting from the summer of 1902, going into the next spring, Ungern was first made to prepare himself for the College of Naval Cadets by taking special courses at a private tutoring school in Reval. These courses helped him pass the needed entry exams, and on May 5, 1903, he finally enrolled in the College of Naval Cadets. On the cusp of adulthood, Ungern was now 17 years old. The purpose of the military school was to produce the elite of the Russian naval establishment. Therefore, there were many courses in technical areas as well as social etiquette. At this time, Ungern would have had direct contact with the Tsar's court, as Tsar Nicholas II regularly visited the military school. Senior cadets also performed guard duty at Tsar Nicholas's Winter Palace, which was located not far from the military school. The military school was thoroughly nationalistic, devoted to Tsar, faith, and fatherland, with an austere routine. At a set time of the day, all of the students in Ungern's class ate together at a mess hall from the same unchanging menu. Living quarters were sparse, drillings were endless, and teachers made no attempt to make their curriculum interesting to their students. Punishment was swift and harsh for any cadet who violated school rules, punishments which typically involved some form of solitary confinement. Relations between staff and students were strained. Students despised teachers, and administrators and staff looked down upon their students. The cadets were not taught to think autonomously, but rather to give correct responses and be obedient. At first, Ungern performed well academically, but by his third semester his grades began to drop dramatically. In the beginning of 1904, the Russo-Japanese War began, and talk of the war became a daily part of life at the College of Naval Cadets. By the fall of 1904, Ungern was now once more near the bottom of his class. Ungern's disciplinary record was once more active, as he incurred, over the course of around 3 semesters, 42 violations. These ranged from oversleeping, missing class, fighting, smoking, returning late from leave, losing his documents, and failing to maintain regulation-length hair. Defiance of superiors was also committed by Ungern. In one such incident, while posted to sentry duty aboard a ship during a training exercise, Ungern wandered off. When confronted by one of his superiors over his walking away from his duty, Ungern snapped, "I'm not some sort of manservant. I don't have to stand in one place." On January 9, 1905, large groups of workers gathered peaceably in front of the Winter Palace, carrying icons of the Tsar, pleading for him to address the issues they experienced in Russian society. The reason remains unknown to this day, but at some point the Winter Palace guards opened fire upon the crowds. Nationwide outrage followed, and riots and civil unrest broke out throughout the nation. Ungern's school was put on lockdown, while older students armed with rifles took turns guarding the school. By early 1905, The College of Naval Cadets sent a telegram to Ungern's family urging them to withdraw their child, lest he face certain expulsion. On February 18, 1905, Ungern's parents pulled him out of the school. A mere 3 months after leaving the College of Naval Cadets, Ungern volunteered for the 91st Divinsk Infantry Regiment in Reval, Estland, on May 10, 1905, as a private volunteer. He likely intended to join the fighting of the still ongoing Russo-Japanese War. On May 21, 1905, 2 weeks after enlisting in the army, and after a brief period of combat training, Ungern boarded a troop train bound for new regiments in Manchuria. The long railway journey, which took place along the Trans-Siberian Railway, took Ungern across the central and eastern ends of the Russian Empire. For the first time in his life, Ungern was now seeing the eastern fringes of the empire. The train took Ungern on a vast journey through St. Petersburg, Moscow, the Volga River, and across the Ural Mountains into western Siberia. From there, the journey continued still further across the Yenisei River in eastern Siberia, before bypassing Lake Baikal while moving southwards into the city of Chita. While bypassing Lake Baikal, Ungern was formally instated into his new regiment, the 12th Veliki Luki. Qing Dynasty territory was soon reached, before going another 600 miles before finally stopping at Harbin, the capital of the Russian Empire's Manchurian territory. The entire journey took about 3 weeks. In early June of 1905, Ungern reached his assigned regiment, the 12th Veliki Luki, in the rolling hills of central Manchuria on the outskirts of Mukden. However, the war with Japan was all but over by this time. Ungern saw no combat. Due to the chaos wrought by the revolution of 1905 and logistical delays along the Trans-Siberian Railway, Ungern was not able to head back to European Russia immediately. The revolution made its way to Ungern's parents' home on December 1905, when it was burned down by a mob of peasants, spurred forward by the nationwide civil unrest and resentful of the Baltic German nobility. Dozens of other manors were razed to the ground by these mobs before they were finally suppressed by German militias and units of the Imperial Russian Army. Though Ungern saw no combat in the war with Japan, he did experience many aspects of East Asia during his 8-month wait to return to Europe. Ungern had close contact with Chinese, Manchurians, and the Russians whom interacted with these people on a regular basis. He also experienced the diverse city of Harbin, which was a melting pot of different European and Asian cultures and languages. Upon his arrival back to European Russia in February 1906, Ungern returned to St. Petersburg to continue his training to become an officer, but this time he decided to pursue a position within the army instead of the navy. Ungern applied and was accepted to Paul I Military Institute, located less than a mile from the Naval College. Ungern's experience in the Far East changed him because grades and conduct were now markedly improved from his days at the College of Naval Cadets, earning a C average in his classes while incurring not a single reprimand. On June 15, 1908, 2 years after beginning training, Ungern, with the Tsar watching, graduated in the highest tier according to conduct, and was made an officer in the Russian Imperial Army. For his first posting, Ungern chose to serve with the Cossack host, the Transbaikal Cossacks. This grouping of Cossack regiments guarded the border between the Russian and Qing empires near the areas of Outer Mongolia and Manchuria. Due to his decision to serve in the Asian half of the Russian Empire, Ungern received 1 month's leave before being allowed 15 days to report to his assignment. On July 27, 1908, Ungern stepped off the Trans-Siberian Railway car and set foot in the city of Chita, which served as the headquarters for the Transbaikal Cossack host. Ungern then went to the headquarters of the 2nd Company of the 1st Argun Regiment in Military Sector 2, which was near the small outpost of Usnarynsk. This settlement, which had less than 100 residents, being located in a sparsely populated region, was right next to the Qing Empire border while being adjacent to the Argun River. Undulating steppes surrounded Ungern in all directions, burnt golden brown by the summer sun. It was a land of climatic extremes, freezing cold in the winter and blazing hot in the summer. Spring offered the only respite from the brutal weather when the reeds of grass became green and flowers blossomed. Ungern's Cossack host was mainly composed of Russians, but other nearby hosts had numerous Central Asians in them, such as Tungus and Buryats. Ungern was wholly unique among his peers in this region, in that he was the only Cossack from noble birth and to have attended an elite and prestigious officer training school. On several occasions, his hosts defended the Argun region against bandits who attempted to steal horses and livestock from Cossacks. In February 1910, Ungern left the Transbaikal Cossacks under mysterious circumstances, supposedly because of a sword fight carried out while intoxicated. Whatever the exact context or reason, Ungern received a wound on his forehead at this time that would go on to give him intense headaches for the remainder of his life. 2 months later, Ungern enlisted in another Cossack host 400 miles to the east, the Amur Cossacks, whom were headquartered in the village of Blagoveshchensk near the Amur River. Despite his privileged noble upbringing in the European part of the Russian Empire, Ungern by this point had proved himself every bit as in tune with the rugged existence on the frontier of the empire as any of his Cossack comrades whom had lived their entire lives in the region. Indeed, in 1912, 2 years after his enlistment with the Amur Cossacks, a performance review he got from his company commander stated that he rode with flair, loved cavalry work, enjoyed services in the field, had a strong intellect, read both military and general literature, knew several languages, was popular with fellow Cossacks and morally sound, and possessed a gentle character and a kind heart. The Amur region was just as desolate and sparsely populated as the Transbaikal region, with the majority of the population centered around the capital of Blagoveshchensk. Beyond the capital, the majority of the region was essentially a vast uninhabited forest. Ungern was posted at the district center of Ekaterina-Nikolsk, which was located about 330 miles south of Blagoveshchensk, along the middle section of the Amur River. Though its population was only about 1,400 people, this amount still made it the largest settlement for hundreds of miles. The settlement sat atop a large cliff, which overlooked the Amur River. Ungern spent most of his time at this post, quartered in the barracks near the settlement. Otherwise, Ungern went on patrol or policed the border while occasionally performing customs work. Ungern also took part in drills and war games as well. The Amur Cossacks also tasked Ungern with training settlers in defensive military tactics. In 1912, Ungern received a promotion and acquired the rank of senior lieutenant. On February 21, 1913, in tandem with festivities throughout the Russian Empire, the entirety of the Amur Cossack force gathered in Blagoveshchensk to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty. Ungern and his fellow Cossacks attended a service in the Annunciation Cathedral before parading down Blagoveshchensk Street toward the Amur River. They then stood and listened as their commanders addressed them. "Remember this day. Prove yourselves worthy of your ancestors who so gloriously served our great Russian state, and the mighty czars and the emperors of the Romanov house." In July 1913, Ungern resigned from the army. In the letter addressed to the Tsar, he explained that difficult family circumstances was the cause. As was the requirement of all resignations, Ungern had to register with the reservists. Ungern requested and was granted permission to rejoin the Transbaikal Cossacks in the event of a war. In August 1913, Ungern arrived in the Mongolian town of Olyastai, 1,000 miles west of the Amur region, with the intention of going further west to the Mongolian town of Kobdo, a Chinese trading and garrison settlement. In Olyastai, Ungern met Alexei Berdukov, a Russian merchant who was also traveling to Kobdo. Berdukov had been told by the Russian consul to wait before heading to Kobdo because Ungern, whom had just rode into town and who was also heading that way, would make a great traveling companion. Seated upon his horse, Ungern trotted to the Russian consulate building, dismounted, and tied his horse to a wood pole as Berdikov walked out of the consulate building to introduce himself. Berdikov later, in his memoirs, would describe Ungern's appearance and demeanor as such. He was sunburned and scruffy, with the blank, dark eyes of a madman. The blondish beard he had grown on the road made him look about 30 years old. His uniform was unbelievably filthy, with worn trousers and holes in the tops of his boots. He had a sword and pistol at his side. A Mongol postal rider carried his rifle. The pack on his horse was empty. All he seemed to have with him was a small canvas road bag with a bundle sticking out from one end. To see a Russian officer riding across Mongolia like this, with no bedding or supplies, or even a change of clothes, left a truly strange impression. Traveling rapidly, the two men traversed across the difficult landscape and within 3 days were in Kobdo. The month and year was now August 1913. Inexplicably, Ungern had left a steady post with a Cossack regiment in the Amur region to essentially go to the westernmost part of Mongolia to do whatever he wanted to do, without being tied down with the typical duties required of being an officer in the military. It is not known with certainty what Ungern did upon arriving in Kobdo. In fact, the next 12 months of Ungern's life are a complete mystery. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife Sophie were shot to death in Sarajevo, Bosnia, by Gavrilo Princip, a Yugoslavian nationalist. In retaliation, on July 28, 1914, Austro-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and soon afterward invaded the country. In response, on July 30, 1914, the Russian Empire set the gears in motion that would mobilize all its active duty soldiers. On July 31, 1914, the German Empire, an ally of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, demanded that Russia cease its mobilization. Russia chose not to answer Germany's demand, and as a result, Germany declared war on Russia. On August 1, 1914, the Russian Empire, politically loyal to Serbia and the Western European powers, finally declared war on Germany. On September 3, 1914, and now 27 years old Ungern, upon getting wind of the news of the general mobilization, immediately enlisted with the 34th Don Cossack Regiment of the First Army, a hybrid unit with both cavalry and infantry located in European Russia. The First Army was commanded by Paul von Rennenkampf, a great-uncle of Ungern. By the time Ungern made it to the front lines and was integrated into the regiment, it had already been pushed back onto Russian Empire lands due to a German counterattack after earlier having penetrated into East Prussia. Ungern's baptism of fire came near the small village of Balverzhinsky, located in present-day southwestern Lithuania, as he reconnoitered the surrounding areas. In this area, Ungern took part in attacks and counterattacks that led to substantial territorial gains and losses, a pattern repeated over and over again during a short length of time. This fluidity was due in part to the vastness of the Eastern Front of the First World War, as opposed to the static trench warfare which dominated much of the fighting in Western Europe. In a letter sent to one of his aunts, dated November 1914, Ungern reflected on his wartime experience thus far while thanking her for her gifts of chocolate and a silk shirt. Last month in Prussia, my patrol was surrounded, and we managed to jump the German wire only at the last minute. By the time they figured out what was happening and started shooting, we were already out of range. We got out all our wounded. The only trophies we left behind for the Prussians were a few injured horses. They must have been quite annoyed about that. In December 1914, Ungern was moved to the 1st Nerchinsk Regiment of the Transbaikal Cossacks, his original Cossack regiment that he had picked after graduating officer school. By this time, the regiment had fallen under the authority of the Ussuri Horse Division, a cavalry detachment comprised of various Cossack regiments from the Far East. In this rare photograph taken on February 16, 1915, Ungern is seen on the far left alongside fellow officers interrogating a captured German soldier. Knowing the language of the enemy and having a German last name was at times a cause for distrust amongst his fellow men. But Ungern continually dispelled these suspicions by putting the skill to work towards aiding the Russian Empire. In April 1915, north of Warsaw, a spectacular incident of bravery and cunning was documented, whereby Ungern used his German language skills to deceive German soldiers. According to a fellow officer who recorded the event, Ungern and his men laid on their bellies and crawled toward the German trenches a little after midnight. When the first line of wire was reached about 25 yards from the position, the Germans opened fire. Ungern leapt to his feet standing behind the wire and shouted in German, "You there! What's gone into you? Stop your shooting, it's your own men." After this, the firing ceased and a voice called out from the darkness of the trench, "Who goes there?" Ungern and his men called back, "It's us." The Germans started shooting again. Ungern, still standing at full height, called out a second time, "You swine, hold your fire. Your nerves are getting to you. You're shooting your own people." After this, having fallen for the trick, the Germans began crawling out of their trenches to cut the wire. Ungern's men then opened fire and after an intense firefight, took over the position. Commencing in the fall of 1915 and going on for the next 6 months, Ungern's unit continually carried out operations well behind enemy territory along the Austro-German front. Despite Ungern's bravery, leadership, and cunning, his unit experienced astronomical losses. During the fall of 1916, Ungern's commander described the situation of the Ussuri division. After nearly 3.5 months of uninterrupted fighting, at times against superior enemy forces, in mountainous terrain with no roads, exclusively on foot, with irregular rations, and often without any feed at all for the horses, our force has reached a dismal state. We have run out of reinforcements. During the Ussuri Division's lengthy campaign, enemy trenches lay at times a mere 50 yards away, and every day brought artillery bombardments, sniper assaults, and raids. Ever since Ungern's days as an army officer training in St. Petersburg at Paul I Military Institute, Ungern had managed to avoid getting into trouble with authorities. But something in him changed, perhaps due to the war, that caused him to engage in conduct unbecoming of an officer while on leave in the Ukrainian town of Chernivtsi near the Carpathian Front in November 1916. For this infraction, Ungern received a court-martial. According to court records, Ungern and an officer friend arrived at a hotel in Chernivtsi in the middle of the night, looking for a room. Ungern was drunk. The clerk told him that the hotel had no vacancy. An argument erupted and Ungern lost his temper. He struck the doorman and shattered a window. He then stormed over to the town commandant's office where he cursed at a junior officer on guard duty and likewise struck him across the head with his sheathed saber. At this point, Ungern slumped into a chair and fell into a drunken slumber. Shortly thereafter, Ungern was arrested. In a deposition created the next morning, Ungern confessed to everything and did his best to sincerely apologize. Taking Ungern's extraordinary wartime record into account, the military court of the 8th Army held a quick trial and sentenced him to 2 months in a military prison. Ungern was indeed an exceptionally brave and dutiful officer in the Russian army. Between the start of the war and late 1916, he was wounded 5 times and earned 5 commendations, including the St. George's Cross, the Russian army's highest honor for valor. Ungern certainly had many opportunities to prove his combat prowess, as by late 1916 he had served on multiple different fronts: southern Lithuania, north-central Poland, Lithuania again, and the Carpathian Mountains. In February 1917, in Petrograd, the capital of the Russian Empire, a succession of worker strikes and riots over food shortages progressively brought out an increasingly larger crowd of people into the streets. At first, the government was not at all alarmed as they had dealt with and handled numerous such incidences in the past. But when on the 3rd day, the soldiers they sent in to pacify the throngs of people joined the rioters, the situation for the government took a turn for the worst. Soon after this mutinous action, the entire city of Petrograd had effectively joined the revolt against the government. As a city government separate from the country was formed, many Petrograders called for the cessation of Russia's participation in the First World War and the monarchy. Unable to see a solution to the crisis at hand, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, giving his seat of power to his younger brother Prince Michael, whom promptly refused the offer. Within about a week, the February Revolution had ended the 3 centuries-old Romanov dynasty. After being released from military prison sometime in the spring of 1917, Ungern then joined a regiment facing the Ottoman army on the Persian front near the town of Urmia in northwestern present-day Iran. A close friend of Ungern, Grigory Semenov, whom he had met earlier in the war, was also in the regiment. Semenov, an officer with the Trans-Baikal Cossacks, was a short, stocky, and gregarious man, seemingly the opposite of Ungern. Semenov also did not come from a noble background. Instead, he came from a humble Cossack family near the Mongolian border and graduated from a second-tier officers' school near there. However, what they both had in common to a high degree was bravery, as they both were recipients of the St. George's Cross. Along with having both served in Far Eastern Russia, they were also both brash individuals who believed deeply in the traditional values of the officer class. By this time in the spring of 1917, the ripples of the February Revolution had made their way to the front lines. And as a result, soldiers became freewheeling in nature, and in particular flaunted this in the face of their officers, whom were at times lynched in extreme cases. Most soldiers had no more fight left in them. Many deserted and headed home while others stayed on the front lines, but openly proclaimed that they would only defend the front lines from attack, but not attack themselves. Sometime in April 1917, while both Ungern and Semenov were posted at the Assyrian village of Golpashan, east of Urmia, they, after some discussion, presented an idea to their commanders, which entailed the formation of new units of native volunteers. They explained to their commanders that creating units comprised entirely of members of a particular minority within the empire and using them in offensive operations would shame Russian soldiers into fighting. Semenov used his Mongolian and Buryat language abilities to ask Buryat elders in the area of Outer Mongolia to send young men to Persia to be formed into a Buryat national unit. Ungern planned on recruiting and training Assyrian Christians, whom had suffered greatly alongside the Armenians at the hands of the Ottomans, into their own national units. It was the hope of Ungern that these Assyrians would be looking to avenge their murdered people on the battlefield. Both of the national units that Ungern and Semenov created failed to have any effect on the rapidly deteriorating morale of the Russian army. During the summer of 1917, Semenov was chosen to lead his regiment at the Second Trans-Baikal Congress in Chita. On the way to the Congress, he stopped in Petrograd and asked the War Ministry for permission to start creating native regiments again once he arrived in Siberia. Soon after arriving in Chita in the Far East, sometime during the late summer or early autumn, Semenov asked Ungern if he would come and join him. Ungern agreed and was in Chita by October. On October 25th, 1917, one of the most pivotal events of the 20th century occurred. Deeply resentful of the provisional government led by Alexander Kerensky, the Bolsheviks in Petrograd launched a coup with paramilitary forces that rapidly took over key governmental buildings in the capital. Though the seat of power of the former Russian Empire had fallen to the Bolsheviks, a vast array of anti-communist and anti-Bolshevik forces quickly mobilized to counter the revolution. After the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks had managed to take over parts of the Trans-Baikal region. Therefore, Semenov had to re-establish his base outside the area, inside the town of Manchuria Station, the first station on the Chinese Eastern Railway. In December 1917, Semenov had set about readying the forces he had put together to fight the Central Powers earlier that year into a force that would fight the Bolsheviks. One of the first army units Semenov created was called the Special Manchurian Detachment, named as such as it was headquartered in Manchuria Station. By August 1918, Semenov and his Special Manchurian Detachment had retaken many areas around Manchuria Station, including the small settlement of Dauria and the key city of Chita, which was turned into the capital of the state that he had carved out. Further bolstering Semenov's cause was the commencement of Imperial Japanese Army support, which wanted to establish Semenov as a sort of puppet ruler of a Siberian buffer state that they planned on creating to eliminate Russia as a threat to their interests in the Far East once and for all. Once Semenov had retaken the city of Chita, 6,000 Japanese soldiers were deployed in it to help defend it from the Bolsheviks, as well as aid Semenov's war effort with supplies of weapons, money, and logistical support. Flushed with victory, Semenov placed the seat of his government in a posh hotel not far from the main train station. Ungern was then appointed commandant of Dauria by Semenov. Located along the Trans-Baikal Railway near the Argun River, Dauria was a small settlement with brick-built barracks, an old armory built during the Russo-Japanese War, horse stables, a telegraph office, a church, and a few Cossack dwellings. Dauria was a lonely, isolated settlement, a vast expanse of rolling hills of steppe, punctuated by the occasional Mongol or Buryat yurt, stretched in all directions towards the horizons surrounding it. Once in Dauria, Ungern began to create his own military force. At first, Ungern wanted to concentrate on creating national units that would only consist of soldiers from one nationality. But due to logistics and practicalities, he changed his mind and decided to create a mixed nationality force. This force was christened the Asiatic Cavalry Division, and would quickly grow to consist of many European and Asian nationalities, such as Russians, Ukrainians, Bashkirs, Tatars, Buryats, Tungus, and Mongols. Included in this diverse mix was also a group of Austrians and Ottomans, whom were once prisoners of war captured by the Russian Empire during the First World War. To meet the spiritual needs of this melting pot, an Orthodox priest, an Islamic mullah, and Buddhist lamas were also included into the division. Division offices were also closed for the observance of Buddhist, Muslim, and Orthodox holidays. Wanting especially his European officers to gain the respect of Central Asians, officers were required to attend Mongolian language classes, unless they wanted to come face to face with Ungern's harsh military discipline. The main objective of the division was to defend the border region of the Trans-Baikal Railway, which was a lifeline for Semenov's state. The division stationed itself all along the railway while also conducting patrols of the surrounding areas and carrying out maintenance work of bridges and train tracks. The local population in this region of Semenov's state was indifferent or hostile to the division, and as a result Ungern resorted to whatever means necessary to keep the division well funded. This included thievery in the form of boarding stopped passenger and cargo trains along the Trans-Baikal Railway and seizing any kind of valuables the passengers may have had on them and hauling off any bulk items that may have been on the freight trains. Many items like jewelry and gold were then resold to Russian and Chinese suppliers in Hylar and Harbin, often on credit, thereby further heightening the drive to steal more. However, supplies such as grain and livestock were kept for the use of the division. When no money or supplies were on hand for the soldiers, desertions resulted. Thus, Ungern had to steal to keep the division going. Russian authorities in Chinese Eastern Railway towns, located in northern Manchuria, along with the civilian governing authority in Chita, voiced their opposition to the thievery, interrogations, and executions at Dauria. Civilian investigations were started, but there was little anyone could do as the region was essentially under the rule of military dictatorship. In Dauria, Ungern began to wear a unique uniform. This uniform consisted of a customized Mongolian deal that had epaulets sewn on the shoulders, along with his St. George's cross pinned to the chest. The uniform was a symbolic fusion of European Russia and Asian Russia. As Ungern built up his division and fortified the area around Dauria, his domain became a dumping ground for suspected Bolsheviks, both real and imagined. Once at Dauria, Ungern supervised the interrogations and tortures of these detainees. Anyone was fair game to Ungern, including Russians as well as any foreigner. After Ungern had felt he had gotten all the information he could get from his victim, he proclaimed "To the hills!" and the victim was then dragged away to one of the grassy hills outside of Dauria and shot. Each execution was followed by documentation produced by one of Ungern's officers who had some legal knowledge. As well as an interrogator and a military leader, Ungern also became sort of a diplomat during this time, as his political ambitions compelled him to travel frequently throughout the region. Ungern traveled to the Trans-Baikal, northern Manchuria, Mongolia, and even Beijing to meet with followers of Yuan Shikai, the former Chinese president. Frequent correspondence with contacts in Urga, Hylar, and Harbin were maintained as well. To bolster ties with a Chinese warlord based in Manchuria, Ungern on August 16, 1919, married one of his daughters in Harbin. Her Russian name was Elena Pavlovna, and they communicated in English. Soon after their wedding, Ungern and his wife began living separately, Ungern at Dauria and Elena at Manchuria Station. Within a year, they ended their marriage. By the spring of 1920, the Asiatic Cavalry Division had grown to 105 officers, 1,233 cavalrymen, and 365 infantrymen. At this point, Ungern had now served as the second most powerful man in the region, after Semenov, for around 2 years. By late 1920, the situation was looking grim for the White Cause, as by this time Alexander Kolchak, the nominal supreme leader of the White Cause, was now dead, having been captured and executed by the Red Army. Furthermore, many cities in western Siberia along the Trans-Siberian Railway had fallen to a massive Red Army offensive, which culminated in the creation of a buffer state called the Far Eastern Republic, whose purpose was to shield European Russia from the Japanese. The Red Army would have pressed onwards towards the Trans-Baikal, but had to divert men and material back to Europe for the ongoing war with Poland. Semenov viewed these developments apprehensively as he planned his next move. Events took a turn for the worst for Semenov and Ungern when Japan abruptly ordered its troops to withdraw from the Trans-Baikal region, including Chita, and fall back to the Amur region and the city of Vladivostok. The Red Army quickly got wind of this withdrawal, and knowing that Semenov did not stand a chance without Japanese military support, swiftly launched an attack on Chita on October 1920 and promptly took it over. Just as the Red Army was approaching Chita, Semenov fled the city in a biplane headed towards Dauria, where the Whites had further fortified the area in anticipation of a siege. In either September or October 1920, Ungern scrapped a plan to block the path of the Bolshevik advance into Chita, and decided instead to take his division into Mongolia through its porous borders, going through Aksha, which was a settlement 180 miles to the west of Dauria. Ungern did not consider his entry into Mongolia to be an invasion. Rather, he saw him and his division as no different from the hundreds of other regional inhabitants who went to and fro from the border, whether they be herders, merchants, nomads, or soldiers. Due to desertions and the loss of several artillery pieces, Ungern's force was nearly halved, and now only consisted of about 800 men and their horses, followed by a caravan of carts, covered wagons, and pack animals. The reason for the change of the original plans, which had been formulated with Semenov, was that Ungern thought that Chita had already been captured by the Bolsheviks, and Semenov had fled, even though neither was true at that point. After crossing the border into Mongolian territory, Ungern galloped 50 miles south with his division to the highest point of the Karaulin River, a sector of the river that was rich with fodder and pasture. Ungern wasted no time in making his next move, and quickly decided that he would launch an assault upon the Mongolian capital of Urga, which is now present-day Ulaanbaatar. Though Urga was for the most part controlled by Chinese Republican soldiers, Ungern viewed the new government that had replaced the recently deposed Qing dynasty in China as Bolshevist. This, along with the fact that many Russians who lived in its enclave supported the Bolshevik war effort, was reason enough for Ungern to launch an assault on Urga, with the intent of taking it over. Ungern also hoped that once in control of Urga, he would be able to win over many new recruits to his cause, as well as have the opportunity to form political alliances with former Tsarist officials, Mongolian lamas, and especially the Bogd Khan, the spiritual leader of Mongolia. Ungern's first two assaults on Urga in late October and early 1920 were repulsed by the dug-in Chinese Republican soldiers, whom almost wiped out his division. In retaliation for the assaults, the Chinese troops in Urga arrested dozens of Russians and Mongols, suspected of having pro-Russian sentiments. Chinese troops even threatened to kill all Europeans in Urga if there was another assault. Retreating back to the Karaulin River, Ungern spent the freezing winter resupplying his force with goods carted in from Manchuria, corresponding with leaders of Mongol clans of Senem warriors, while also recruiting from the tattered masses of White Army soldiers whom had been trickling into Mongolia from a now Bolshevik-controlled Siberia. Before the penetration into Mongolian territory, Ungern's force had the outward appearance of a traditional military unit, due to its use of drills, inspections, and roll calls. However, during this time of supplying and diplomacy while camped out weathering the harsh Mongol winter, the appearance, health, organizational structure, and morale of his division began to deteriorate. Their uniforms became tattered rags, and scurvy afflicted the troops, while roll calls and drills ceased. To make matters worse, desertions also began to rise. In the midst of all the privations, the breakdown of military discipline and the greatest offense, desertion, were insufferable to Ungern. To stymie desertions, Ungern became an even more severe military disciplinarian. Brutal beatings and other cruel punishments were meted out for even the smallest infractions. In certain instances, Ungern carried out the punishment himself, using a horsewhip, which was tied to his belt at all times. A favorite punishment was to have the offender stand for hours atop a frozen river, with the inevitable numbness and resultant frostbite setting in. Despite it all, many men stayed loyal to Ungern, as they all looked forward to conquering Urga, as he had promised them that they could keep 2/3 of the spoils, with the remainder going to the division as a whole. For Ungern's Mongol allies, the coming assault on Urga was personal. Many looked forward to settling old scores with the Chinese, whom had swindled them in their shops and stolen their herds. Ungern's recruitment drive paid off, as by February 1921, his Asiatic Cavalry Division had grown to about 5,000 men. With this newly acquired strength in men and material, Ungern started to plan for a third assault. During planning, Ungern ordered his officers that all Jews and socialists had to be killed upon capture of the city. Furthermore, wanting to capitalize on his officers' and men's desire for personal enrichment, Ungern promised his men that upon capture of the city, they would have 3 days to loot Urga. 2 days before Ungern's planned attack, Ungern launched a raid on the Bogd Khan's winter palace to release him from the custody of the Chinese, whom had placed him under guarded house arrest after Ungern's first 2 failed assaults on Urga. The raid, done in the middle of the day, took the Chinese completely by surprise, which compelled many of them to retreat from the city before the main assault had even begun. 2 days after the raid, Ungern launched his third assault upon Urga. The Asiatic Cavalry Division attacked the town from the east and the south. The main bulk of Ungern's forces struck from the southeast, while another detachment struck from the east to confront the Chinese garrison near the Chinese sector of Urga. Ungern's Tibetan troops traversed Holy Mountain to secure the Bogd Khan's winter palace and the surrounding area. After a fierce firefight, especially in the Chinese quarter of Maimai Chang, the Chinese soldiers retreated north towards Kyakhta, leaving Ungern and his division in control of the city. Almost immediately after the fighting had ended, 2 pogroms occurred simultaneously, one aimed at the socialist and Jewish people of Urga, perpetrated largely by Ungern's European troops, and another aimed at Chinese people, led mostly by Ungern's Mongolian troops. Ungern did not like the unplanned and spontaneous pogrom against the Chinese, as he only saw the Chinese Republicans as an enemy, rather than the Chinese people as a whole. On the other hand, Ungern planned for and encouraged the pogrom against the Jews and the socialists. Ungern's Transbaikal Cossacks had lists of Jews to be persecuted, culled from spies as well as from the town newspaper. During the execution of the pogrom, a few Jews successfully hid or fled the city. Unfortunates stuck in the city at the time received beatings and summary executions, while women were also raped. Over 300 Jews perished in the massacre. Like many other officers and leaders in the White Movement, Ungern was undoubtedly a virulent anti-Semite. Ungern often characterized them in a way that not only dehumanized them, but also described them as an existential threat to the well-being of the entire world. After the authorized 3-day period of mayhem, Ungern immediately ordered all looting and other criminal activities to cease. Ungern ordered his men to clean the city, and forbade his men and any other Urgans from looting Chinese shops. Many Russians and Mongols challenged this order, and were quickly executed by hanging. After law and order had been restored to Urga, Ungern ensured that the Bogd Khan was ceremoniously returned to a throne of power over the city. In return for this restorative act, the Bogd Khan bestowed upon Ungern a series of titles, including the rank of Khan, and the title of the great hero general and builder of the state. Ungern was also given special privileged permission to don a 3-eyed peacock plume in his Manchu-style purple hat, which typically signified that one was a member of the highest nobility. Buddhist monks interpreted Ungern's victory over the Chinese as a fulfillment of the Shambhala prophecy, whereby the forces of evil would be defeated, leading to an eternally blissful era. Other men under Ungern's command also received lesser honors and rewards for their heroics. In the midst of all the celebrations, a former Tsarist official named Pershin commented on the appearance of Ungern's division. All around were Cossacks, horses, carts, and still more Cossacks dressed in the most varied outfits. You couldn't call them uniforms. The only thing that made it clear that they were Cossacks was their tall sheep's wool hats and their sabers and rifles. And the faces, God only knows the different types. Such a mixture of different races and tribes, from Russians from European Russia and Siberia, to Bashkirs, Kazakhs, Tatars, and Buryats. We've got all kinds, one of Ungern's men told me, and that seemed to say it all. After the ceremonies, Ungern wasted no time in solidifying his control of the region around Urga. He chased the Chinese troops retreating north towards the Russian border, while also engaging other enemy forces to the west and south. At the same time, he also established communication with other white forces in the country and urged them to arrest suspected Jews and socialists. With the acquisition of power, Ungern now went about putting his power towards civilian purposes. He seized gold and other valuables from the Russian and Chinese banks in Urga to help fund the repair of its roads, bridges, and telegraph lines. Ungern also had his engineers repair the city's electric station and build a telephone system and wireless station. Ungern also published a newspaper, reopened schools, and protected trade. Ungern and his Asiatic Cavalry Division appropriated cars, cannons, rifles, and machine guns from the armory of the Chinese troops, all of which was equipment that would be near impossible for the division to acquire legitimately. Lacking sufficient volunteers from Urga to augment their ranks, Ungern simply press-ganged much of the able-bodied male population into his division. This group of newcomers included a diverse mix of Mongols, Buryats, Tungus, Russians, and Chinese POWs. Each of these newcomers were made to sign contracts, which bound the new soldiers to serve the division in Mongolia and beyond. Wanting to ensure that the political future in Urga remained friendly to monarchism, Ungern established a security office to detect Bolshevik spies in the city. Ungern also gave governmental positions to former Tsarist officials that still resided in and around Urga. At around this time, while visiting a town on the outskirts of Urga, Ungern met a European man whom he felt he could confide with privately in a way he could not with his officers or his soldiers. This man was named Ferdinand Ossendowski, a Polish refugee of the ongoing Russian Civil War, science fiction writer, geology professor, and mystic. Ossendowski explained to Ungern that he was an anti-communist Pole who desired to make it to the Pacific Ocean so that he could get back to Poland. After initially suspecting Ossendowski of being a Bolshevik spy, Ungern's mood toward Ossendowski softened. Ungern took pity on his situation and agreed to give him safe passage back home as long as he accompanied him for the next couple of days. Ossendowski agreed to the proposition, and the two of them returned back to Urga. During one of their many conversations, Ungern confided to Ossendowski the reason for his seemingly casual brutality. Some of my associates in the movement do not like me because of my atrocities and severity. They cannot understand as yet that we are not fighting a political party, but a sect of murderers of all contemporary spiritual culture. Why do the Italians execute the Black Hand Gang? Why are the Americans electrocuting anarchist bomb throwers? And am I not allowed to rid the world of those who would kill the soul of the people? I, a Teuton, descendant of crusaders and privateers, I recognize only death for murderers. Ungern also engaged in more diplomacy at this time. He wrote several letters, and sent them out to many allies and potential ones as well, including Mongolian Khans, Chinese warlords, White Army commanders, Kazakh leaders, and a spy of his posted in Beijing. Many of these letters were written in a very paternalistic and arrogant tone. At the heart of every letter was the assumption that he, Baron Ungern, knew what was best for everyone else. Several letters were full of military advice and comments on the international political situation. All statements were written under the assumption that the receiving party wanted the advice. In a letter to a Mongol ally, Ungern urged him to ignore any worries he may have regarding his goal of resurrecting the Qing dynasty, clearly implying that such an occurrence would be for the greater benefit of China, because it would be for Mongolia's own good and the greater good of the world at large. Ungern's reasoning was one of compromise, as he believed that since Mongolia was incapable of defending its own borders on its own, therefore Mongolia needed to be under the control and protection of another more powerful neighbor. In a set of letters to a Chinese leader, Ungern displayed some traits of selflessness, as he explained that his purpose as a nobleman was to restore kings for the good of the world, before going on to say, "Personally, I need nothing. I will gladly die for the restoration of the monarchy, if not in my own state, then in another." Baron Ungern Sternberg. In numerous letters, he expressed millenarian views, by declaring that a light is coming from the east, the restoration of the emperors. I know and believe that a light shall come from the east and bring happiness to all mankind. In a draft of a letter that was never sent to their intended recipients, a group of Kazakh leaders, Ungern urged them to look to the west, look at its past full of fire and blood, and the vicious savage struggle of man against God. The West has given man science, wisdom, and power, yet it has also brought godlessness, immorality, treason, the abnegation of truth and goodness. There in the West, the destruction of entire empires has begun. Whole nations are being led to their deaths. In a letter to another Mongol leader, Ungern said, "True success shall come when we take up the ideas of truth, honor, and goodness, and act not out of petty economic or material interests or on the basis of financial calculations, but rather in the name of the immutable, eternal values of purity and sacredness of religion, and the creative power of Bogd Khan and the Manchu Khan." All of these recipients were perceived by Ungern as being potentially sympathetic to monarchism. What he asked of these potential allies was a helping hand in recreating the borders that had existed before the Russian and Chinese revolutions. Astoundingly, Ungern even went so far as to suggest that a superpower state should be created, encompassing all of the pre-revolutionary borders of Central Eurasia, a nation that would stretch to the same size as the empire Genghis Khan created in the 13th century. This fantastical idea gave rise to the notion that Ungern fancied himself a latter-day Genghis Khan and sought to make himself a ruler of this new realm. However, Ungern never saw himself as a monarch. Instead, he saw himself as a kingmaker, one who supported and restored the system of monarchy. Therefore, Ungern had every intention to help install another person other than himself upon the throne of this modern-day Mongol Empire. The Bogd Khan was viewed by Ungern in much the same way he saw himself, as a noble servant of a higher monarchical authority. Once monarchy had been restored in East and Central Asia, Ungern had grandiose desires to see monarchy likewise restored across Europe. This grandiose idea was never given a detailed execution plan. To think right now of restoring the emperors of Europe is impossible, because of the rot that has taken hold of European learning, and hence of the European peoples themselves, who have been driven mad by socialist ideas. So, for the time being, one has to restore the Middle Kingdom and all the peoples within it, stretching to the Caspian Sea, and only after that can one think of beginning to bring back the Russian monarchy, assuming, that is, that the Russian people come to their senses about this. But if they don't, then the Russians will have to be conquered. Baron Ungern Sternberg. Despite this sequence of events Ungern laid out, in May of 1921, Ungern changed his mind and began to plan a campaign against Bolshevik-controlled Siberia with the purpose of restoring the Russian monarchy. Ungern was certain that once he entered Bolshevik-controlled Siberia, anti-communist residents would rise up in revolt in massive numbers, and the remaining White Army units in the region would all be inspired by this to consolidate into a large army. Practical matters also factored into Ungern's decision to assault the border regions. By the spring of 1921, Ungern was really low on supplies, which led to a string of robberies committed by his men in Urga. Boredom and idleness also began to set in within the ranks of his men, leading to many incidents of public drunkenness. As a result, relations with the Mongol civilians became increasingly strained. By this time, the Mongols also understood that Ungern's primary goal was not the preservation of Mongolian independence, but rather the restoration of the Qing dynasty, with it controlling Mongolia, and the restoration of monarchies throughout Eurasia. This agenda deeply disillusioned the majority of Mongols, who wanted nothing more than to be free and independent, and made it even harder to justify Ungern's bizarre and brutal actions that made them call his sanity into question. Sometime in April or May of 1921, Ungern began planning his next move. With the help of an officer of his in Ossendowski, Ungern put together a strange document that outlined his coming plans. In May of 1921, Ungern made the fateful decision to penetrate Bolshevik-controlled Siberia, by first attacking the Russo-Mongol border town of Kyakhta with his Asiatic Cavalry Division. As Ungern and his men exited Urga and advanced upon Siberia, Ungern issued a special order to his troops called Order Directed to Russian Units Operating on the Territory of Soviet Siberia No. 15, or Order No. 15 for short. This was the document he had crafted earlier with Ossendowski and one of his officers. Despite the full title of the order, none of Ungern's men were in Soviet Siberia at the time, nor did Ungern have any contact with any white forces in the region. Many copies were also printed for dissemination to the white forces and the general population in Mongolia and Siberia. In Order No. 15, Ungern grandiosely proclaimed that he, acting under the orders of Semenov, would bring destruction to the Bolsheviks, and that afterward there would be a new beginning resulting in the restoration of the monarchy. With regards to the restoration of the monarchy, Ungern proclaimed that Prince Michael, whom Tsar Nicholas II had attempted to hand power over to in 1917 after stepping down from the throne, but whom refused, is the lawful ruler of Russia. Ungern explained that this would be achieved in the wake of his assaults on Bolshevik Siberia coming not just from his men, but also from Semenov's Japanese-supported forces in the Ussuri region. Ungern then goes on to order the white forces in Bolshevik Siberia to coalesce around larger units and willingly place themselves beneath the command of a leader picked by Ungern. Ungern's virulent anti-Semitism is also on stark display. Commissars, communists, and Jews are to be eliminated together with their families. Baron Ungern Sternberg. Ungern drew a sharp contrast to times in the past, governed by chivalrous notions, to the struggle against the Bolsheviks which he urged must be waged as a merciless war of annihilation. Today only one form of punishment is acceptable, death by varying degrees. The old ways of justice based on truth and mercy have changed. Now truth and merciless severity must prevail. The evil that has come to earth to destroy the divine soul of man must be ripped out root and branch. Baron Ungern Sternberg. Taking great inspiration from Christian eschatology, Ungern explained that the battle with the Bolsheviks would be the final battle between good and evil, that would lead to the end times, after which the forces of good would ultimately prevail, due to divine intervention on the part of Archangel Michael, an angel meant to represent Prince Michael. According to Ungern, God himself would then sort out the rest. Believers would receive deliverance, and the wicked would be annihilated. Aside from these vague descriptions, no detailed political or military plans on how to achieve these objectives were outlined in the order. Soon after the issuance of the strange order, on the night of either May 19th or May 20th, 1921, Ungern ate dinner with a few of his officers and Ossendowski. After they had finished eating, Ungern told them all that they were to follow him to the yurt of Jan Bolan, the Grand Duke of the Buryats. Walking behind the Russian settlement of Urga, they came across Bolan's yurt, entered it, and were met with several of his servants who gave them food. For the next hour or so, Ungern and Bolan regaled each other with war stories from the Great War and the Russian Civil War. At around midnight, Bolan left his yurt, after which Ungern told Ossendowski and the others, "I want to have my fortune told once more. For the good of the cause, it is too early for me to die." Just then Bolan re-entered his yurt with a fortune-teller prophet, who often did business with the Buryats. The fortune-teller proceeded to perform a series of rites, while whispering incantations, when suddenly she fell to the floor convulsing, while stuttering the description of her vision for all to hear. I see the god of war. His life runs out. Horribly. After it a shadow. Black like the night. Shadow. 130 steps remain. Beyond darkness, nothing. I see nothing. The god of war has disappeared. She then lay motionless before being taken away by a pair of Buryats. Ungern, taken aback, at first brooded, and then excitedly announced, I shall die, but no matter. The cause has been launched and will not die. I know the roads this cause will travel. The tribes of Genghis Khan's successors are awakened. Nobody shall extinguish the fire in the heart of the Mongols. In Asia there will be a great state from the Pacific and Indian Oceans to the shore of the Volga. The wise religion of Buddha shall run to the north and the west. It will be the victory of the spirit. A conqueror and leader will appear, stronger and more stalwart than Genghis Khan and Ugadai. Why? Why shall I not be in the first ranks of the warriors of Buddhism? Why has karma decided so? But so it must be, and Russia must first wash herself from the insult of revolution, purifying herself with blood and death. And all people accepting communism must perish with their families, in order that all their offspring may be rooted out. Ungern then made it clear to his audience that he intended to leave Urga very soon, and that he also had every intention to die very soon as well. Shaking everyone's hand and giving farewells, Ungern exited the yurt. This was the last time Ungern would see Ossendowski. Ever respectful of Ossendowski and his wishes, Ungern had made all the necessary arrangements, ensuring that he would be able to make it to safety. Several days later, along with a group of other travelers, Ossendowski arrived on a train in Peking, China. Soon after this fatalistic speech to his close associates, Ungern launched his crusade against Bolshevik Siberia. Trotting along the road toward Kyakhta on horseback, Ungern's cavalrymen sat in their saddles, decked in dark blue deals, with epaulets running down their shoulders. Each regiment of his division had their own unique banner. Ungern's regiment carried the standard of his crusade. a paean to tradition, religion, and monarchism. The standard was colored bright yellow, bearing the face of Christ next to the slogan "God is with us" on one side, while the other side had the letter and Roman numerals of M2, signifying Prince Michael II. At the vanguard of the division was a band playing music, and in the rear were cannons being pulled by camel. The Asiatic Cavalry Division was divided between the commands of Ungern and Ruzukyan. At this moment, the division's total strength was around 3,600 men. Upon arriving in the vicinity of Kyakhta in June 1921, Ungern and his men were met with an overwhelming Bolshevik force, prompting them to retreat. Worse yet, none of the locals in the region rose up against the Bolsheviks, as was wishfully planned by Ungern, and none of the scattered white forces united with his force. Even worse was the sizable desertion of many of his Mongol allies, who had little interest in fighting on foreign soil for Ungern's goal of restoring Eurasian monarchies at the expense of Mongolian independence. Despite these setbacks, Ungern and his men scored a number of wins against the Bolsheviks, at one point getting to within about 40 miles of Verkhnoi-Dinsk, the capital of the Bolshevik puppet state of the Far Eastern Republic. Fearing the loss of their client state, the Bolsheviks launched a counterattack, routing Ungern. On July 6, 1921, while Ungern was on the run from the Bolsheviks about 100 miles to the north of Urga, the Bolsheviks, with a combined force of Red Army regulars and Communist Mongols, seized an undefended Urga. Ungern eventually took his force west into the valley carved out by the Salunga River. From here, he crossed the Russo-Mongol border again and tried to move in the direction of Verkhnoi-Dinsk. Sporadic skirmishes continued on and off in this region among the hills, valleys, and swamps for weeks. Despite the potentiality of chaos from being harried so often, Ungern maintained firm control of his division through iron discipline in the way of beatings and executions. Also harassing Ungern's force were bands of Bolshevik partisans, whom supported the Red Army and its objectives, but had no official allegiance to it. Logistical issues plagued both sides, but Ungern was at the clear disadvantage, as he had to make do with horseback riders to deliver written orders. Furthermore, Ungern had no conception of the location of the enemy. By contrast, the Bolshevik force was much more technologically advanced, with its use of biplanes for reconnaissance. At this point, as the situation got worse, Ungern planned to go west with his force to the western corner of Mongolia, in the Tuva-Urian-Kai region, with the intention of merging with other white forces holding out there. Unfortunately for Ungern, many of his officers disagreed, and wanted instead to go back to safety to Manchuria and the Russian Far East. His officers had had enough of Ungern, and likely considered the fight against the Bolsheviks to be a lost cause. Together they conspired to mutiny against Ungern. When the mutineers told Ruzukyan, Ungern's second-in-command, of their plans, he balked at the suggestion, and in response, they killed him. Over the course of the next 2 days, the mutineers discovered that Ungern was going to be arriving at their encampment to have a meeting with the now-deceased Ruzukyan. Upon learning of this, they hatched a plan to kill Ungern. In the dead of night, a group of men on horseback descended upon Ungern's encampment, and emptied their clips and tossed grenades into the tent that they believed that he was in. As soon as Ungern heard the sounds of gunshots and explosions, he immediately thought it was a Bolshevik raid. Therefore, he burst out of his tent, and seeing his own men on horseback, immediately rushed back into his tent, realizing that a mutiny was at hand. Thinking that Ungern was now riddled with bullets, the mutineers then rode off back into the night. Unbeknownst to the mutineers, they had assaulted the tent containing Ungern's orderlies. Ungern's tent was somewhere else in the vicinity. With the mutineers gone, Ungern crept back out of his tent, and leaped onto his horse, and galloped full speed to a wooded area, where he hid for the rest of the night. By daybreak, August 20th, 1921, he set out to find his Mongol company, which he considered to be his most loyal troops. Upon finding them, Ungern set out west with them. After a few miles of traveling with them, the Mongols knocked him off his horse and tied him up. The rest of the Mongols dismounted and stood and conversed, while a few others stood guard over bound to Ungern. A little while later, a group of men on horseback appeared in the distance. As they approached closer, Ungern immediately recognized their allegiance, and began shouting while still tied up, "The Reds are coming! Spread out!" Fearing the brutal fate that he felt assuredly awaited him upon capture, Ungern, despite being tied up, managed to feel about in the lining of his deal for the tablet of poison he had there. But his fingers grabbed nothing but silk fabric. His poison had fallen out at some point. The Mongols were caught completely off guard and were quickly surrounded and disarmed by the 17 men. The Bolshevik commander Pyotr Shchetikhin then approached the group and questioned Ungern briefly, before sending him and his Mongol troops under escort of about 20 men to the 104th Brigade HQ. Soon after this, Shchetikhin's men then transported Ungern out of Mongolia to Turai, a small village on Bolshevik territory. Ungern was then transported to Kyakhta by cart, down the valley formed by the Jada River. On the way to Kyakhta, Ungern attempted suicide again, with a pair of horse reins, but was unable to as the straps were too thick. From Kyakhta, Ungern was then transported north by boat, on the waters of the Slunga River, all the way to Verkhorodinsk. From there, Ungern was then transported by rail further northwest to Irkutsk. At Irkutsk, the Bolsheviks seated Ungern in a room and took multiple photographs of him. These would go on to become the most widely known photographs of Ungern. From Irkutsk, Ungern was then transported finally to Novonikolaevsk. During this leg of Ungern's journey, Ivan Smirnov, a Soviet government minister of the Siberian region, sent out a telegraph informing Lenin and Trotsky that Ungern was in their custody and was on his way to Novonikolaevsk. Smirnov further explained that Ungern was to be tried for treason, while explaining that the trial will have great political significance. On August 29, 1921, the Politburo telegraphed Lenin's orders back to Smirnov. Devote special attention to this matter, determine the reliability of the charges, and if they are reliable, of which there seems little doubt, hold a public trial, conduct it with maximum speed, and shoot him. Vladimir Lenin. During the entire trip, Ungern was watched and guarded at all times, including during bathroom trips, and was interrogated constantly. During bathroom breaks, one unarmed guard went inside the bathroom to watch him, while another armed guard stood outside. Ungern was interrogated extensively, at several points during the trip, for the primary purpose of gathering information that would be used at the coming show trial planned in Novonikolaevsk. His Bolshevik interrogators questioned Ungern on everything from military tactics, logistics, his network of contacts, and his political and religious views. Regarding Ungern's religious views, the interrogators commented, "Believes in God. As a Protestant, understands God as good and evil as the opposite of God. Describes himself as a fatalist and believes strongly in destiny. Infected with mysticism and assigns great importance to the role of Buddhism in the fate of the peoples. Sees himself as called to the struggle for justice and morality in accordance with the teachings of the Gospels. Does not view his cruelty and terror as contradicting the Gospels. Speaks calmly of shootings, murders, executions of various degrees, and all manner of punishments." Throughout the questioning, Ungern was truthful and easy to work with, but was at the same time extremely aloof and listless, as noted by his interrogators. Early in the morning on September 7th, 1921, Ungern finally arrived in the city of Novonikolaevsk. Having finished their trip and interrogated him at various points along the way, Ungern, along with the interrogator's notes, were then handed over to Ivan Pavlunovsky, the chief of the Novonikolaevsk Cheka. After a brief period of legal preparation, the show trial was finally held on Thursday, September 15, 1921, in Novonikolaevsk. The venue chosen for the event was the Pine Tree Theater, located in a park bearing the same name nearby the Ob River. The theater was a lengthy rectangular building that was representative of the types found in public parks throughout Europe at the time. On the day of the trial, a large crowd of workers and Red Army soldiers attended the event and packed tightly into the dimly lit hall, looking upon an empty stage upon which stood a table draped with a red cloth. Hushed murmurs filled the musty hall, which became whispered hisses, and then silence as the 5 tribunal judges entered the stage and took their seats behind a long rectangular table covered in red cloth. The now silent audience rose out of their seats and stood. Ungern was then brought out on stage wearing his deal, cap, epaulets, and St. George's cross. Also entering the stage with Ungern was a man named Bogolyubov, his court-appointed defender. As the clock struck noon, Chairman Oparin of the tribunal then read the indictment and the 3 charges leveled at Ungern. First count: aiding and abetting the expansionist plans of Japan by attempting to create a Central Asiatic state and seeking to overthrow the Far Eastern Republic in the Transbaikal. Second count: seeking to overthrow Soviet power in Russia, and Siberia in particular, with the intention of restoring the monarchy by placing Mikhail Romanov on the throne. Third count: committing mass atrocities and torture against peasants and workers, communists, state workers, Jews, whom were slaughtered to a person, children, and Chinese revolutionaries. Ungern proceeded to plead guilty to all 3 counts, but denied the accusation of being in league with the Japanese. After these preliminary proceedings, a back-and-forth questioning and answering session then took place between the tribunal and Ungern, with Ungern being questioned and him giving the answers. When you occupied Urga, were there murders and robberies? Yes. First troops fought against troops, but then the Mongol residents began fighting with the Chinese. Did you issue an order to stop searches that were not approved against everyone except Jews? What did you mean by this? Did you want to destroy all Jews? Yes, I declared the Jews as outside the law. Who ordered the workers of Centrosoyuz to be killed? I did. Why? Because they worked for the Soviet government. In the midst of this, Defense Counsel Bogolyubov asked if the judges would allow Ungern to undergo a psychological examination in order to determine if he was sane or not. Bogolyubov continued explaining that he wished to pursue a potential insanity plea. The judges denied this request, and unsurprisingly, Ungern himself did not wish his ideas and actions to be seen as those of a madman. Ungern was then asked if he wanted to make a final statement, to which he declined to make. Designed to give a lesson in socialism to the audience and the new country at large, prosecutor Yaroslavsky made his final statement, explaining that Russia before the revolution was a country ruled by nobles. When their land and power was taken away, they joined the forces of the White Armies. In particular, Yaroslavsky showered particular scorn upon Ungern's Baltic German background. We know very well that there has never been a greater species of exploiters than the Baltic barons. They are parasites who literally latched themselves to the body of Russia and then sucked on it for centuries. Beginning his closing arguments, Yaroslavsky mocked Ungern's politics. And what's this political system? He doesn't have one. Nothing at all, except to bring back the beating stick and put Mikhail Romanov on the throne. Ungern's defender Bogolyubov tried to frame this characterization in a way that made Ungern seem harmless to Soviet society and the revolution, by arguing that because Ungern lacked political clout and had ridiculous ideas, Ungern and his ideas would gain little traction in society at large. Continuing his closing arguments, Yaroslavsky countered, and further stated that people like Ungern were a threat to Soviet society and had to be executed, because if he were to ever see his plans realized, Russia would become a military dictatorship, Romanov power would be restored, peasants would lose land, and people would once again be powerless. At 5:20 p.m., the verdict was read, and Ungern was given the death penalty. Soon afterward, Ungern was executed by a single bullet to the back of the head. The day after Ungern's trial and execution, the party leadership in Novonikolayevsk confirmed the events in a telegram sent to Moscow. Soon after Ungern's capture by Bolshevik partisans, the Asiatic Cavalry Division splintered into fragments. Some of the men managed to make it to Manchuria, but many were eventually arrested by the Chinese. Most others, though, were captured by the Bolsheviks in Mongolia. White resistance in Mongolia continued sporadically until the early part of 1922. Many of the Bolsheviks who dealt directly with Ungern were themselves either executed or persecuted during Stalin's Great Purge. Semenov, Ungern's ally and mentor, was one of the longest-lived of all involved, as he managed to live in self-imposed exile in the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo until it was invaded by the Soviets in 1945, leading to his arrest. He was then sent to Moscow, where a show trial awaited him, after which he was hanged in 1946.